Hello everyone, it's Friday and you're watching Within the Frame. I'm Kim Bo-kyung. Since the U.S. approved the transfer to Ukraine of American-made F-16 fighter jets, Denmark, the Netherlands, and most recently Norway announced that they would provide them. Ukrainian President Vlodomyr Zelenskyy hailed the agreement as historic. However, some say it won't be enough to overwhelm Russian defenses. Meanwhile, after Russia's withdrawal from the Black Sea grain deal, Russia reportedly is preparing for a new agreement with Türkiye and Qatar, while Ukraine is working to finalize a deal with global insurers to cover grain ships traveling through the humanitarian corridor established by Kyiv. How are such events expected to develop? For this, we invite Ivelina Cherevko, a Ukrainian scholar studying Korean history at Seoul National University, into the studio. Ivelina, welcome to the show.
Pleasure to meet you.
Pleasure to see you. And we also have Dr. Malcolm Davis, a senior analyst at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. Good to see you, Dr. Davis.
It's great to be here.
Thank you for being with us. Now, Dr. Davis, first let's talk about F-16 fighter jets. The Netherlands, Denmark, and just recently Norway to have announced that they will provide Ukraine with much sought-after U.S.-made F-16 fighter jets. What is the reason behind such a decision?
Well, essentially what these countries realize is that Ukraine needs modern air power and more of it to be able to punch through and defeat Russian defenses on the ground, but also to defend the country in the air. The Ukrainian people are suffering under constant missile attack. So by selling or transferring the F-16s to Ukraine, it gives the Ukrainian Air Force a much greater capability to defend their airspace against these Russian missiles and drones, and also to be able to support forces on the ground to enable them greater opportunity to make more progress in the ongoing counteroffensive.
Right, so Ukraine is right now in need of air defense superiority. Now, Dr. Davis, as I said before, Ukraine has long been asking for F-16 fighter jets. Why so, and what other weapon system is Ukraine in need of?
Well, the F-16s are very important. The Ukrainians, I believe, are also talking to Sweden about the Gripen, which is a similar sort of fighter jet to the F-16. The other weapons that the Ukrainians are very interested in are long-range missiles, in particular what's known as the ATACMS, the Army Tactical Missile System, which has a 300-kilometer range and would give the Ukrainians the ability to strike direct into the rear of the Russian forces, to hit their logistics points, their command and control systems, and make it, once again, easier to make progress in this ongoing counteroffensive, which is moving quite slowly at the moment.
Right, I see. No, Dr. Davis, this just popped up in my mind. I'd like to ask you, is there any possibility that Ukraine would be able to get this ATACMS that you have earlier talked about?
It's an issue that has been essentially being discussed by the Ukrainians with the Americans for some time now. I think the Americans are concerned that if they give the ATACMS to Ukraine, that they could be used to strike at targets directly into Russia. But to be fair, you know, that's already happening with other types of systems such as drones and so forth. So I think there's time for the Americans to actually sit down with the Ukrainians and accept the reality that the Ukrainians do need systems like ATACMS to be able to make further progress. But as to the timelines, as to when that would happen, I think it's probably hard to say. I would hope certainly before the end of this year.
Right, I see your point. Now, Dr. Davis, many say the supply of F-16s is not going to be a silver bullet, as it is unlikely that Ukraine will be able to receive these jets until next year. How much should this supply be expedited so that it can be a big help to Ukraine?
Well, look, it certainly should be expedited as much as possible, but the reality is it will take time for the Ukrainians to train on these aircraft, and not just the fighter pilots in the cockpits, but also the ground crew and the maintenance staff as well. So, you know, the timelines for next year are correct, but this war is going to go on into next year. It's not going to be resolved this year. The counteroffensive by the Ukrainians is moving slowly because they're having to go against determined and prepared Russian defensive positions. So it's likely to go through the winter and into the spring of 2024 and potentially into the summer of 2024. And that's when the F-16s will make real difference in the air and on the ground.
Right, I see. Now, shifting gears a little bit here, Ivelina, I'd like to ask you a question. The Ukrainian war is getting prolonged quite long right now, and though the U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said that Biden administration is quite confident that they will be able to secure this additional funding for Ukraine, the CNN poll says 55% of Americans are opposed to Congress authorizing the funding. How do you believe people should be looking at the Ukrainian war?
Well, first of all, I'd like to emphasize that throughout the course of a full-scale invasion, the American people and people all over the world have demonstrated a tremendous support to Ukraine, and we Ukrainians appreciate it very, very much. And yes, war is expensive, and aiding a country that is in active phase of war is not cheap. And of course, some may question whether it's the right way to spend their taxes in the United States. But at the same time, I think that the figure of 55% means that people are rather opposed the decision to provide military assistance to Ukraine, like weapons. But Ukraine needs assistance in many other sectors, like reconstruction as well. And then what I feel is also the way we look at this number, because yes, while 55% is roughly represents the half of the American population, it also means that the other half of American population supports assistance to Ukraine. And I think it's important, just like many other countries and nations all over the world, they are against Russian aggression, and they realize that Russian aggression is a violation of all the norms, international laws and norms, and that the only way to stop this war is to support Ukraine and to provide assistance to Ukraine.
Right. Now, Ivelina, one more question. The Economist pointed out that the disappointing pace of Ukraine's counteroffensive has been soaring at the public mood, and it talked about an example that one all-woman volunteer organization supporting Ukrainian units on the front line have been struggling as hopes of a quick breakthrough have been dwindled. How are Ukrainians seeing the war right now?
Well, personally, I feel myself slightly a bit frustrated whenever I come across these manipulative headlines, especially from pretty decent newspapers, let's say. But obviously, war is not easy. And of course, Russians, they are ruthless. And they are indifferent of the number of casualties, whether it's their own soldiers or Ukrainian civilians. And moreover, throughout the past few decades, they've been working on weapon production. And it will be stupid to underestimate them. Of course, their claims that they are the second best army in the world failed. But they still have a large number of weapons, and this number of weapons largely outnumbers what Ukraine has, and that's why, again, Ukraine needs weapon supports. Then, regarding what you said about volunteer organizations, I still think that it's amazing that in the face of war, all Ukrainians, both individuals and groups, they united and started fundraising campaigns to support army. But prolonged war is tiring, and it's natural that people are getting tired, and the war is also devastating for economy. So I'm sure that many people, they still want to help, but they simply don't have resources to help. So we also should account for this. And then again, about the tiredness, many people's optimism, yes, diminished and probably is replaced with slight frustration. But at the same time, the recent exit polls can show that all Ukrainians, they support their military leadership. They stand with our soldiers. And actually, recently, our chief commander, Valery Zaluzhny, had just mentioned that Ukraine is getting close to the breakthrough. So I suggest that we wait and see.
Right, right. I mean, I hope this prolonged war doesn't discourage people. And Dr. Davis, let's delve a little bit deeper to Ukraine's counteroffensives. Though Ukraine has not claimed responsibility for some of the cases, there has been a series of drone attacks in the Moscow region in recent months, and Russia has been accusing Ukraine of being behind this. Are those drone attacks proving to be either effective or helpful for Ukraine?
Look, I don't think they're necessarily going to change the outcome of the war in terms of suddenly seeing a massive Russian retreat by themselves. But what they are doing is striking important psychological blows against the Russian regime. They're basically demonstrating to the Putin regime that Ukraine can bring the war to Russia. And it's also demonstrating to the Russian people that this war has consequences for them. And obviously, Ukraine is not setting about attacking civilians. That's not the way they work. They're not like the Russians in that sense. So the Ukrainians, if indeed they are supporting or coordinating these strikes with drones, they are picking targets that have military relevance. And so I think these sorts of strikes can be useful to increase the pressure on the Putin regime. Ultimately, where peace will be emerge will be once the Ukrainians have successfully broken through the Russian defensive lines and have retaken all their territory, including Crimea. And at that point, once the Russian forces are defeated, then you can have some sort of negotiation about how we maintain that peace afterwards. And that would have to include Ukraine becoming a member of NATO. But for the time being, Ukraine has to continue this war, and the Western community has to continue to support Ukraine and provide the sorts of weapons that it needs to be able to ensure that it can win.
Right, I see. The drone attacks could definitely have a psychological effect on Moscow. Dr. Davis, so citing several officials, the New York Times pointed out that a decision by Ukrainian commanders to divide its forces and power could be the reason behind Ukraine's grinding counteroffensives, though we are waiting for it to see how the breakthrough is made. How do you see this view?
Look, I think that if Ukraine concentrates its forces too much, it then makes them more vulnerable to Russian counterattacks. And the worst thing that could happen right now would be if the Ukrainians took really heavy casualties as a result of such counterattacks. So what the Ukrainians are doing, I think, at this stage of the current offensive is the correct thing. They are essentially advancing on a broad front, trying to identify weak points in the Russian defenses. And when those weak points are identified, concentrating forces then to break through wherever possible. But the reality is that this counteroffensive has been delayed in part because of Western hesitance about providing the sorts of types of weapons that we talked about earlier, such as ATACMS. And indeed, the F-16s could have been supplied earlier. Had those weapons been supplied earlier, then the Ukrainians might have had a better chance of catching the Russians off guard. But the Russians have had time to build up very thick defensive lines that are well prepared. And so it is hard going at the moment. But just because it's hard going and slow moving at the moment doesn't mean that the Ukrainian counteroffensive is going to fail. It just means it's going to take some time, and we need to be patient and realize that this will carry on into the spring and summer of 2024 and potentially a bit longer.
Right, I see. We need to be patient, and I cannot agree more. Now, Ivelina, let's talk about grain issues. Russian drones struck Ukrainian grain facilities at the Danube River port of Izmail on Wednesday, and it apparently reduced the port's export capacity by 15% and destroyed 13,000 metric tons of grain. Could you tell us details about this event and what impact could this have on Ukraine?
Well, according to Ukrainian officials, Russia destroyed several private grain terminals and warehouses. And the thing is that it's not the first attack by Russians in that region when they destroy infrastructure and prevent Ukraine from food exports. According to the Ukrainian officials, there have been also very similar attacks on the port of Remy that when Russians destroyed 35,000 tons of grains. And it's been their eighth attack on these Ukrainian ports since they withdrew from this Black Sea grain initiative.
Right.
And according again to Ukrainian officials, throughout this month, and they withdrew on July 17th, throughout this month, they destroyed over than 270,000 tons of grains. And the thing is that it doesn't end with Ukraine, because Ukraine, being a global grain exporter, it has this domino effect on global food supply chain, and then it basically means that it threatens global food security, because countries in need that critically rely on Ukrainian agriculture, especially in Africa or Asia, basically it's 400 million people that rely and need these grains, and now they may not receive it. So it's a big and much bigger problem. And then there is also a strategic effect, because Russia is trying to prevent Ukraine from food export, and also psychological effect, and not just on Ukrainians but on the whole world.
Right. And to prevent such a domino effect, Dr. Davis, Ukraine has been devising a plan with global insurers to cover grain ships traveling through its Black Sea ports using a humanitarian corridor that has been earlier set up by Ukraine. Now, what is this about, and how do you expect this to work out?
Well, look, I think what it is about is giving a greater deal of insurance against interference by Russian naval vessels in the Black Sea. Insurance obviously is an important aspect for maritime security. If that insurance can be provided, then it's easier for commercial companies then to maintain those shipments through that humanitarian corridor. But I think ultimately what will be required if the Russians do try to interfere with those ships is for some sort of international naval force to deploy into the Black Sea fleet, Black Sea area, to escort those ships. Obviously, that would then require Turkey to allow passage through the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles into the Black Sea, and allow international maritime security operations to escort those vessels. That would then generate a potential risk for some sort of confrontation between that international maritime flotilla and the Russians. But the Russians do have to understand that if they take that step, they are potentially widening the war. And, you know, I think there would be consequences for them in doing so. So this insurance step is but a first step in the process. Ultimately, though, we may need to escort grain shipments out of Ukraine through that humanitarian corridor and out of the Black Sea itself.
Right, I see. Now, Ivelina, meanwhile, media outlets say that Moscow is working on a new grain export deal with Türkiye and Qatar. Now, what do we know about this?
Well, not much is known as of now, but from what has been reported, apparently, yes, Russia is in negotiation with Qatar and Turkey regarding this new export deal, instead of the previous one that allowed Ukraine to export 33 million metric tons of grains. But the thing is that what Russia aims is to deliver agricultural products to African countries, and they want Qatar to sponsor the shipments, and they want Turkey to manage the deal. But the thing is that Turkey seems to opt for the previous agreement that they had with Ukraine, and the Turkish foreign minister, he made a statement that he would want Ukraine to continue this food shipments, the grain shipments, and that he would also prefer this previous deal to be observed by and supervised by the UN as it was. So I think that it kind of shows a Turkish position on the issue, but at the same time, the problem is that if indeed Turkey and Qatar goes ahead with this decision, it will basically legitimize illegal food exports from the regions that were occupied by Russians, Ukrainian regions. And it will legitimize it, and then it will also sort of prevent Ukraine from taking actions against Russian vessels in the Black Sea. So it's very important.
Right. Well, Dr. Davis, the Ukrainian ambassador to South Korea, he also expressed concerns about this, saying Russia could open up a way to fund the war through grain exports if a separate agreement is made. What's your view on this?
Well, I think obviously that sort of path for an additional line of funding for Russia has to be shut down. The objective has to be at the economic level to isolate Russia as much as possible from the international community. That's incredibly difficult because Russia does have an awful lot of support in what's known as the Global South, and the BRICS are meeting at the moment in Johannesburg. And I think that the problem is that we can try to impose sanctions, we can try to cut off Russia's access to international financial routes, but if that isolation is not complete, if there's avenues and pathways for the Russians to gain access to funding through things such as grain deals and so forth, then that gives them money to potentially purchase weapons or build weapons to sustain the war. So it's an imperfect situation because unfortunately some states in the Global South, as well as potentially states like China and North Korea and Iran, are essentially supporting Russia rather than trying to bring the war to an end.
Right, I see. Well, I'd like to ask many more questions to our guests, but unfortunately, this is all the time we have for today's edition. Thank you, Dr. Davis, for your time and insights. Thank you. And thank you, Ivelina, for your time as well. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Pakam.
Thank you. All right, that's all for Within the Frame tonight. We'll be next Monday with more in-depth stories. Thank you for watching. Enjoy the weekend. Goodbye.